For centuries, the Roman legionary has been held up as the pinnacle of military might, an embodiment of courage, discipline, and unwavering loyalty. We picture gleaming armor, precise formations, and the thunderous charge of men whose valor forged an empire that spanned continents. But this romanticized image often overlooks a terrifying truth. The very discipline that made Rome invincible was born from a dark heart of unimaginable brutality, a system of punishments designed to instill absolute obedience through the most primal human fear. Imagine, if you will, standing shoulder to shoulder with your comrades, not on a battlefield against an enemy, but facing your own officers. Your unit has failed, perhaps retreated, or shown cowardice. Now a centurion's gaze sweeps over you, cold and unforgiving. You watch as a helmet is passed, filled with lots, some blank, others marked. 1 in 10 of you will die, not by an enemy's sword, but by the hands of your own brothers. The air crackles with the terror of a lottery where the stakes are life and agonizing death. This wasn't some barbarian ritual. This was Rome. These aren't the stories you read in glorious annals of conquest. These are the forgotten tales of the terror that lurked within the heart of the most celebrated military machine the world has ever seen. Rome's legions were legendary, yes, but that legend was forged not just in steel and strategy, but in blood, pain, and profound humiliation. Join us as we strip away the glory and expose the raw, horrifying reality of how Rome maintained its iron grip on its own soldiers, revealing that fear was, in many ways, the sharpest weapon in their formidable arsenal. Among the litany of Roman military punishments, none struck deeper terror into the hearts of legionaries than decimation. It was a word that echoed through the ranks, a visceral threat of collective slaughter, reserved for units deemed to have committed the gravest collective offenses: widespread cowardice, mutiny, or abandoning their standards in battle. This was not a punishment inflicted by the state or an enemy, but by the soldiers upon themselves, turning comrades into executioners. The process was brutally simple, yet psychologically devastating. The offending cohort, typically numbering 480 men, would be assembled. Then lots were drawn. Every 10th man, regardless of individual guilt or bravery, was singled out. The selection was entirely random, a cruel twist of fate that ensured no one felt safe, and everyone understood the arbitrary power of command. Once chosen, these unlucky souls faced their death not from a practiced executioner, but from the very men with whom they had shared their meager rations, endured long marches, and fought side by side. Their executioners were the remaining 9 out of 10 men from their own contubernum, their tent mates, their immediate brethren in arms. Armed with clubs, staves, and stones, they were ordered to beat their 10th man to death. This wasn't a swift, clean killing. It was often a prolonged, agonizing spectacle, designed to maximize pain and psychological impact. The blows rained down not just from a sense of duty, but often from a desperate need to demonstrate their own loyalty and avoid a similar fate. The sheer intimacy of this brutality, forcing soldiers to become murderers of their own kind, ensured that the memory of decimation scarred those who survived as deeply as it destroyed those who perished. One of the most infamous instances occurred in 71 BCE, during Crassus's campaign against Spartacus. After suffering a humiliating defeat where his legions panicked and fled, Crassus ordered the decimation of an entire segment of his army, executing 500 men. He understood that to confront a force as desperate and formidable as Spartacus's rebels, his own men needed to fear him more than they feared the enemy. This shocking display of absolute power reportedly instilled such terror that his legions fought with renewed, desperate fervor, a testament to decimation's efficacy. The trauma for the survivors was profound. They had witnessed and participated in the brutal murder of their brothers. They carried not only the physical scars of the battlefield, but the indelible psychological wounds of having committed fratricide under duress. This shared horrific experience bound them in a perverse, unholy pact, reinforcing the idea that the legion's discipline was paramount and that any failure could unleash its most terrifying internal violence. Decimation was not just a punishment. It was a ritual of terror, a bloody sacrament cementing loyalty through shared guilt and unspeakable dread. While decimation punished collective failure, Rome's military justice system also reserved a special horror for individual transgressions that threatened the very fabric of legionary discipline. This was the Fustuarium, or cudgeling, a punishment so severe that it was often a death sentence, delivered by the very men the condemned soldier had once called comrades. Unlike decimation, the Fustuarium targeted specific, grave offenses committed by individuals: desertion, dereliction of duty such as falling asleep on watch, cowardice in the face of the enemy, or even theft of a comrade's belongings. The spectacle was designed for maximum impact and deterrence. The condemned soldier, stripped and often bound, was forced to run a gauntlet. 2 lines of his fellow legionaries, typically from his own cohort or century, would form up, their ranks extending for a considerable distance. Each man in the line was armed not with a gladius but with vine staffs, the vites, the symbol of a centurion's authority, heavy clubs or stones. As the trumpet sounded, the wretched man was forced to sprint between these unforgiving ranks, a desperate dash for survival. The air would fill with the savage thud of wood and stone against flesh, the shouts of the soldiers and the pained cries of the condemned. There was no mercy. Every man in the gauntlet was expected to strike with full force. To hold back, to show sympathy, could be seen as complicity, inviting the wrath of the centurions and officers who oversaw the brutal ritual. It was a harrowing test of loyalty, forcing soldiers to physically enforce the legion's unforgiving code. The sheer volume and ferocity of the blows meant that most men subjected to the Fustuarium never reached the end alive. They would be beaten, trampled, and crushed into a bloody pulp, their bodies serving as a gruesome warning to anyone contemplating similar disobedience. If by some miracle a man survived the gauntlet, his ordeal was far from over. Such a feat was incredibly rare, a testament to sheer resilience or perhaps the exhaustion of his attackers. But even then, his fate was sealed. He was immediately discharged from the army, stripped of his Roman citizenship and exiled from all Roman territory forever. Survival merely granted him a living death, a permanent severance from everything that defined a Roman man. The Fustuarium vividly underscored Rome's philosophy. Individual failings could jeopardize the entire legion, and thus demanded an equally absolute response. It was a constant reminder that the bonds of camaraderie were strong, but the demands of discipline were stronger, capable of turning those bonds into instruments of fatal retribution. The shadow of the cudgel loomed large in the Roman military psyche,
a constant reminder,
a potent deterrent against any act that might unravel the iron thread of legionary order. Beyond the savage physical punishments, Rome understood the profound power of shame. For a society that valued honor, status, and public reputation above almost all else, psychological humiliation could be a fate worse than death, especially for soldiers whose very identity was tied to their military prowess and virtues. These punishments were designed not just to correct behavior, but to utterly shatter a man's pride and diminish his standing in the eyes of his peers and, crucially, himself. One of the most common and symbolically devastating forms of humiliation was the imposition of barley rations. For the Roman legionary, wheat was the staple, the grain of civilization, the fuel of champions. Barley, on the other hand, was considered fodder for animals, a symbol of agricultural inferiority and even poverty. Forcing an entire unit to subsist on barley instead of their customary wheat was a public declaration of their degradation. It stripped them of their dignity, marking them as little better than beasts of burden. The physical effect was minor. Barley is nutritious, but the psychological blow was immense. Every meal was a reminder of their disgrace, tasted bitter with shame, and silently broadcasted their failure to the entire army. This collective stigma reinforced the idea that dishonor was contagious, and a unit's reputation was a shared burden. Another stark punishment was camp exile. Units deemed cowardly or undisciplined were forced to pitch their tents outside the protective ramparts and ditches of the main fortified camp. Imagine the vulnerability, exposed to the elements, to potential enemy patrols, and to the chilling knowledge that they were deemed unworthy of the legion's collective security. It was a graphic illustration of their ostracization, a public shunning that stripped them of the comfort and safety of the community. This wasn't just physical discomfort, it was a profound psychological isolation, a testament to their abandonment by the very machine they served. Each night spent shivering outside the walls, listening for distant sounds, amplified their disgrace and the precariousness of their position. Perhaps the most culturally shocking form of humiliation involved gender inversion. In Roman society, Masculinity was inextricably linked to military prowess, civic duty, and a rigid code of conduct. To violate these norms was to invite profound contempt. Thus, soldiers or even entire units who showed egregious cowardice might be forced to stand in formation wearing women's clothing. This was an unspeakable degradation. It publicly emasculated them, mocking their failure to embody Roman male ideals. The image of hardened legionaries, symbols of Rome's patriarchal power, dressed in the garments of women, was a powerful and humiliating statement that their manhood, and thus their soldierly worth, had been utterly revoked. The laughter, the scorn, the pity from their fellow soldiers would burn deeper than any whip. The impact of these psychological punishments extended far beyond the battlefield. A soldier's reputation followed him. A mark of disgrace incurred during service could permanently tarnish his standing upon returning to civilian life. His chances of a good marriage, political advancement, or even simple respect within his community could be irrevocably damaged. These were not temporary scars. They were brands etched onto the soul, ensuring that the shame of military failure haunted a man long after his boots left the dust of the legion. Rome understood that to break a man's spirit, you didn't always need to break his body. Sometimes you simply needed to break his honor. For crimes against the very essence of military loyalty, desertion, treason, or inciting rebellion, the Roman state reserved its most absolute and horrifying punishments: crucifixion and slavery. These were fates considered worse than death, designed to not only extinguish the life of the condemned, but to utterly obliterate their dignity and serve as a terrifying public spectacle of Rome's unyielding power. Crucifixion was not merely an execution. It was a slow, agonizing public torment designed to maximize suffering and deterrence. Deserters, mutineers, and traitors were often crucified along major roads or highways, their tortured bodies left to rot as a stark warning to all who passed. Imagine the horror of a legionary marching along the Appian Way, only to see the decaying forms of former comrades, or even men from his own unit, nailed to crosses, dying a prolonged, excruciating death under the blazing sun. Their suffering was deliberately extended, a horrific tableau of Rome's vengeance meant to instill absolute terror in anyone contemplating disloyalty. Perhaps the most infamous display of mass crucifixion followed the defeat of Spartacus's rebellion in 71 BCE. After Crassus's legions crushed the slave army, an estimated 6,000 surviving rebels were crucified along the Appian Way between Capua and Rome. This endless line of suffering bodies stretched for miles, a grim, unforgettable monument to Roman wrath and a chilling testament to the fate awaiting anyone who dared challenge the Pax Romana. While these were mostly slaves, the message to Roman soldiers was clear. Even citizens, if they betrayed Rome, could face similar, if not identical, degradation. Indeed, the vaunted protection of Roman citizenship, a privilege that usually shielded one from such gruesome treatment, offered little solace for the most egregious military offenses. For a soldier who betrayed his oath, that citizenship was revoked, leaving him exposed to the full brutal force of military law. The notion that a Roman citizen could be subjected to the servile punishment of crucifixion, typically reserved for slaves and non-citizens, amplified the terror.
Please, get out of here!
It underscored that the legionary oath was paramount, and its violation stripped a man of his very Roman identity. An alternative, yet equally grim fate awaited those who were not crucified: slavery. Sold into servitude, often to work in the deadly conditions of Roman mines, quarries, or on galleys, these former soldiers endured a living death. Roman mines were notorious for their brutal labor, harsh conditions, and short life expectancies. Trapped deep underground, toiling in darkness, breathing toxic dust, and subjected to the whips of overseers, a former legionary would spend his remaining days in unimaginable misery, a constant reminder of his past transgression and the irreversible loss of his freedom and honor. Slavery was a punishment that offered no escape, only a slow, torturous decline, a perpetual state of disgrace that erased every vestige of the proud soldier he once was. While death sentences were reserved for the most heinous crimes, the everyday discipline of the Roman army was enforced through a constant threat of agonizing physical pain, primarily flogging. These beatings were not mere slaps on the wrist. They were public, brutal spectacles often designed to inflict maximum suffering and leave lasting scars, both physical and psychological. The instruments used were as varied as they were vicious, each tailored to a specific degree of punishment and pain. The most common instrument of corporal punishment was the vitis, the vine staff carried by every centurion. This wasn't merely a symbolic baton. It was a heavy, sturdy length of wood, used frequently and brutally to enforce discipline. A centurion's vetus was his badge of office, and he was expected to wield it mercilessly. A legionary could receive a beating from the vetus for a myriad of infractions, from sloppiness in drills to minor insubordination. While often not fatal, these beatings were excruciating, leaving deep welts and bruising and serving as a constant reminder of the centurion's absolute authority. For more serious offenses, the punishments escalated to the flagrum or flagellum. This was a multi-tailed whip, often crafted with strips of leather or rope into which pieces of bone, metal, or lead balls were woven. Each lash was designed not just to sting, but to tear flesh, ripping strips of skin from the victim's back and leaving deep bleeding lacerations. The flagrum was a tool of extreme torture, capable of inflicting horrific damage with every strike, laying bare muscle and even bone. Its purpose was not just punishment, but often a form of interrogation, used to extract confessions or to break a man's spirit entirely. The most dreaded of these instruments were the plumbatae, whips specifically weighted with lead, sometimes also referred to as a scorpion due to the appearance of its knotted metal-studded tails. A flogging with the plumbatae was almost invariably a death sentence. The weighted ends would not only tear flesh but shatter bone, rupture organs, and cause massive internal bleeding. The victim would be tied to a post, his back exposed, and the lashes would fall, a public display of agonizing retribution. These floggings were never private affairs. They were public spectacles performed before the assembled unit, ensuring that every soldier bore witness to the consequences of disobedience. Specific numbers of lashes were often prescribed for different offenses, but the severity was always at the discretion of the commanding officer. The immediate pain was immense, but the long-term consequences could be even more dire. Many men were left permanently disabled, their backs a crisscross of scar tissue. Infection, a constant threat in the ancient world, often followed, turning a brutal beating into a slow, agonizing death. The scourging post was a stark reminder that Roman discipline was written in blood and pain, a constant visceral threat ensuring unwavering obedience. Beyond physical pain and public humiliation, the Roman military wielded another devastating weapon against its own, the power to inflict a social death. For a society where honor, status, and the promise of a secure future were paramount, punishments that stripped a soldier of his economic stability, rank, and fundamental rights could be more terrifying and soul-crushing than any physical torment. These were sentences that condemned a man to a life of poverty, ignominy, and permanent exile from Roman society. One of the most immediate and impactful punishments was the loss of all pay and bonuses. A soldier's pay, though modest, was his lifeline, often accumulated over years of service, forming a crucial nest egg for his post-military life. To have this confiscated, sometimes years' worth of hard-earned wages, was to condemn him and his family to immediate financial ruin. Without this monetary foundation, the promise of land grants upon honorable discharge, the ultimate reward for a legionary, vanished entirely, leaving him destitute. Reduction in rank was another blow to a soldier's very identity. For many, promotions were the culmination of years of loyalty, bravery, and hard work. To be demoted, stripped of the respect and authority that came with higher rank, was a profound public humiliation that shattered his standing within the legion and his own self-worth. It branded him as a failure, unworthy of leadership. The ultimate social annihilation came with a dishonorable discharge. This wasn't merely the end of military service. It was a complete severance from the privileges and protections of Roman society. Unlike an honorable veteran who received land, a pension, and continued respect, a dishonorably discharged soldier received nothing. Crucially, he often lost his Roman citizenship rights, making him a peregrinus, a foreigner in his own land, without legal recourse or a voice in public life. This exclusion was a social death sentence, often worse than physical execution, as it condemned a man to an existence devoid of meaning and respect in Roman eyes. Adding insult to injury, some severe cases were subjected to marca ignominia, the branding of the forehead. This permanent physical mark, often a letter like D for deserter, indelibly signified his disgrace to the world. It was a public, inescapable tattoo of shame, ensuring that everyone he encountered, from market vendor to potential employer, knew of his failure and dishonor. These punishments together created a state of absolute social and economic ruin for a Roman man whose identity was so deeply intertwined with his role as a citizen and a soldier. Losing everything, his savings, his status, his rights, his very honor, rendered him a non-person. Condemned to poverty and social exile, with an indelible mark of shame. Such a man often found his life after the Legion to be a prolonged, agonizing descent into irrelevance. Rome understood that for some, the loss of everything was a punishment far more brutal and enduring than a quick death. The Roman military operated on the principle of collective responsibility, understanding that the failure of an individual could destabilize an entire unit, and the failure of a unit could jeopardize the empire. Thus, when discipline fractured or cowardice spread, the consequences often extended far beyond the guilty individual, engulfing entire legions in a shared crucible of punishment and ignominy. One of the most extreme forms of collective punishment was the disbanding of legions. This was an act of ultimate condemnation, an erasure from the military rolls, a sentence delivered when a legion's reputation was so thoroughly tarnished that it was deemed irredeemable. The psychological impact was immense. A legion was more than just a number. It was a living entity with its own history, traditions, and fierce loyalty among its men. To have it disbanded was to dissolve this brotherhood, to tell thousands of men that their collective identity and service were worthless, effectively terminating their careers in shame. Even more symbolically devastating was the loss of the eagle standard. The aquila, the silver or gold eagle mounted on a pole, was the sacred soul of the legion. It represented its honor, its history, its very essence. To lose an eagle in battle was the ultimate disgrace, a catastrophe that often prompted desperate suicidal attempts to recover it. As a punishment, forcing a legion to surrender its eagle or having it confiscated due to profound cowardice or mutiny was an act of symbolic death. It stripped the unit of its soul, condemning it to live without its most cherished symbol of pride and identity, an enduring mark of its profound dishonor. Lesser, yet still brutal, collective punishments included forced marches through hostile territory, often without proper equipment or supplies. These were not tactical maneuvers, but punitive exercises designed to break the spirit and bodies of the men, reminding them of their vulnerability and the constant demands of their service. Such marches were often deliberate death sentences, exposing the disgraced unit to attrition, disease, and enemy ambushes, a brutal form of decimation without the lottery. In desperate situations or as a deliberate act of retribution, disgraced units could also be assigned to suicide missions. These were campaigns or battles from which there was little or no hope of return, strategically expendable operations where the lives of the soldiers were sacrificed, either to achieve a desperate objective or simply to remove a problematic unit. Such a sentence underscored the cold, pragmatic calculus of Roman command, where the lives of the disgraced were deemed less valuable than the maintenance of absolute discipline. History records instances of legions so thoroughly shamed or decimated that their numbers were permanently retired, never to be used again. These erased legions served as spectral warnings, their very absence a testament to the unforgiving nature of Roman military justice. The lesson was clear. In the Roman army, your personal fate was inextricably linked to the performance of your comrades, and a collective failure could lead to a collective demise, an indelible stain on the annals of time. We have journeyed through the darkest chapters of Roman military discipline, a harrowing landscape of decimation, cudgeling, public shame, and ultimate societal annihilation. These brutal punishments, far from being isolated incidents, were integral to the very fabric of the Roman war machine. They were the terrifying pillars upon which Rome's legendary discipline was built, forcing soldiers into an obedience forged not just by loyalty and training, but by a pervasive, chilling fear of their own command. There is no doubt that this unforgiving system contributed to Rome's unprecedented military dominance. It created an army that could absorb immense losses, undertake monumental tasks, and maintain cohesion in the face of overwhelming odds. A legionary feared his centurion and his general, often more than he feared the enemy. This internal terror was a constant, invisible force, driving men to acts of courage and endurance they might otherwise never have attempted. But this dominance came at an unimaginable human cost. It was paid in the blood of the decimated, the agony of the scourged, the shattered pride of the humiliated, and the living death of the enslaved. It was a price extracted not just from the guilty, but from the innocent, from comrades forced to inflict unspeakable violence upon each other, leaving psychological scars that ran far deeper than any whip. So we are left with a profound question. Was Rome's military prowess, its ability to conquer and hold vast territories, truly worth the terror and suffering inflicted upon its own citizens and soldiers? As we admire the engineering marvels, the strategic brilliance, and the enduring legacy of the Roman Empire, it is crucial that we do not sanitize the human price of its legendary might. The discipline of the Roman legion was indeed legendary, but we must remember that it was cultivated not solely through valor and loyalty, but by a calculated, systematic application of fear. This sobering reality challenges us to look beyond the glittering image of conquest and consider what this brutal foundation tells us about the true nature of military power, of empire building, and the lengths to which societies will go to achieve and maintain dominance. Throughout all of human history,